Hello again, it's me, Matt. Appreciate you being here on today's military vehicle review of tanks again. Yes, we're going back to the armored world, talking about tanks, specifically the Kampfpanzer 70, or some of you may be aware of it as the MBT-70 program of America. Now, this is a rather unique little vehicle, something that, there's a lot of controversy, a lot of debate. I have had so many discussions about this tank. Some of them a little heated, with some people who get very passionate about it. Some of them have absolutely no care in the world for this vehicle. It's kind of a meme tank in some regard for the fact that it's given a really hard time for no real reason. And it's something I'd like to talk about today because I think it's a bit of history that we should all know if we know anything about modern main battle tanks. And this is almost a sort of precursor tank to take us where we are today with such beautiful tanks like the Leopard 2 and obviously the M1 Abrams, or all of the Abrams series for that matter. Now, the Kampfpanzer 70 is the German sibling of the American MBT, or Main Battle Tank 70 program, born from the 1963 cooperation agreement between West Germany and the United States. To this day, it remains a cautionary tale of how not to develop a tank, and while it is certainly not the only blunder in American or German armor design history, it is obviously one of the best known ones. The development of the Kampfpanzer 70 started with the need to replace the aging M48 and M60 tanks, which are, for the record, absolutely beautiful tanks, and I have done a video on the M48 if you want to go check it out. These vehicles were used in both countries, both Germany and the US. These tanks weren't bad at all, of course, and they had numerous upgrades that were developed for them, resulting in some extreme lifespan extensions, but in the end, even the M60 was still just an interim vehicle that was intended to be replaced. What was needed was something far more advanced and capable of facing the advanced Soviet tanks that the analytics feared of the time. To that end, the United States and West Germany signed a cooperation agreement in August 1963, followed by a December 1963 agreement between the companies that were to make the intent a reality. The joint developed tank was that of the object to this agreement was supposed to be fielded in 1970, resulting in the name of the program, MBT-70 for the American side, and the Kampfpanzer 70 for the German one. For the American side, the designated company was, of course, General Motors. For the German side, it was a company called DEG, or Deutsch. I'm not even going to try and say the word MBH. DEG was a consortium of several industry companies involved one way or another in tank development. The list included Rheinstahl Henschel, Krauss-Maffei, and MAK, or MAC, and several others. Both DEG and GM then participated in discussions leading to the finalized requirements for the future main battle tank. To understand the difficulties both parties faced and the later cooperation breakdown, one has to understand the conditions on which they worked on the project, because this was the year of 1963. The Second World War ended a mere 18 years earlier and was still fresh in the memories of both Americans and Germans. The men who in their 20s liberated Europe were now in their mid-40s, and the horrors of war with Germany still quite relatively fresh in their memory. Another issue was the language barrier and the measurement system, the bane of many promising cross-Atlantic projects, including personally my own. I absolutely cannot stand Imperial. I'm a metric boy, and I'm sure many of you will agree with me that metric is the way. Americans insisted on using the Imperial system, while the Germans naturally preferred the metric system. After many arguments, it was agreed upon to use the metric system for the assembly plans, but both sides kept their own partial drawings in their preferred measuring units, which added to complete chaos when designing this thing. And last but not least, there were the production disagreements. In theory, both sides were supposed to cooperate and pick whichever vehicle component was best regardless of who produced it. But, in reality, each side lobbied heavily for the components produced by its own companies, resulting in a large number of conflicts. And ironically, like a spoiled child, certain developers and engineers were actually escalating really stupid issues all the way to the Minister of Defense level, resulting in massive delays and controversy between designers, engineers, military bigwigs, and everyone else in between. The situation was generally solved by each side continuing the development and continuation of its own design, despite the fact that the other side's components were formally accepted as, quote, backup. In reality, however, two different components would be used. Despite all these issues and the cooperative development, it took off in 1965 and both parties agreed on the basic requirements for the future MBT. These included a fully stabilized main weapon capable of firing on the move, digital fire control system capable of, quote, target leading, stabilized night and day sights, rotating drive position moved to hydraulic traverse turret capability, air-conditioned and NBC or nuclear, biological and chemical protected crew compartments with high-performance 30 horsepower per ton ratio, hydraulic suspension, welded spaced armor for the both hull and turret, and a full NBC protection suite even inside the vehicle when it is being engaged by small arms or artillery fire. In short, the vehicle was to be as advanced as possible for its time and was to include elements not previously used on German or American tanks. Some of the requirements were a source of many heated debates, as I mentioned before. The Germans, for example, had no real need for air conditioning because the tank was to be used in Europe for the defense of West Germany. Now, I can safely say I've been in Germany for many years, and I can tell you it gets really hot in the summer, so I'm not too sure where they came upon getting rid of the air conditioning. If you can put it on the tank, why not? I can't understand why they want their crews to suffer. But of course, we've learned that now with modern main battle tanks being used in desert conditions, because they don't always stay in the host country or wherever they're going to initially be deployed. Tanks could be sent anywhere, so that lesson has been pretty much learned, I think. On the other hand, the Americans envisioned MBT-70's deployment across the globe, including hot countries. The same went for special cold climate considerations. And, of course, then there were the infamous weight limits. Yes, the tank had to be transportable across the ocean in mass amounts, but also it had to be taken on trains and potentially even planes, and this caused major issues for its weight. Of course, during the Cold War, bridges were a huge thing. Many rivers cross across Europe at any one time, and having a tank that is unable to cross certain weight distribution limits is a problem. Both sides agreed on the distinct possibility of a nuclear conflict with the Soviet Union. After all, the Cuban Missile Crisis happened only 3 years earlier, and much thought was given to crew protection, including the installation of the NBC protection unit. In the end, the vehicle received a German ECU, or Environmental Control Unit, consisting of the air conditioner that they didn't initially want, a powerful heater for cold climates, and an overpressure unit with filters for NBC. What both sides did not agree upon, however, was the main weapon. The Germans wanted a high muzzle velocity cannon to kill armoured targets, with the idea of Soviet divisions pouring out of East Germany on their mind. The Americans, on the other hand, wanted a 152mm gun launcher, arguing that this would enhance the crew survivability even further because guided missiles could engage armoured targets at maximum firing distance with higher chances of success. The Germans counter-argued that the woodland and urban areas of Germany would negate such an advantage, and the standard tank cannon can engage a target faster. This debate continued for quite some time. You can kind of see why this tank was having so many issues. In the end, the American opinion won, and the 152mm XM150 low-pressure gun launcher capable of firing the Shillelagh missiles became the weapon of choice. It was basically a longer version of the gun launcher used by the Sheridan light tank, which, by the way, I've also done a video if you want to go check it out. The minimal range of the Shillelagh missile was 650 meters. Any closer and the gunner had to use standard rounds, which included heat, HE, flechette or beehive rounds, and white phosphorus shells, and unlike the Sheridan, armoured-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding Sabre rounds. The Germans worked on the variant armed with the 120mm smoothbore gun, but that was never actually built. And then there was the coaxial 20mm Rheinmetall RH-202 autocannon intended for soft target use. Either way, the XM150 was a massive weapon. Its choice resulted in the decision to install an automatic loader to the turret to keep the size and, more importantly, the weight of this monstrosity of a tank manageable. However, some quite unusual decisions had to be developed. For starters, the autoloader allowed the crew to be reduced to 3 men. The driver would normally be sitting in the hull part, but in the MBT-70, he was moved to the turret, with his station position independent on the turret traverse. Of course, this had its downsides as well. While the driver could see better from the turret than from the usual frontal hull position, the constant traversing and counter-traversing from his position led to huge disorientation, headaches, and clear confusion for both commander and driver. However, this unorthodox solution allowed the crew to sit together like a tight little team and family, which in turn allowed the designers to put a well-protected armoured capsule around them, increasing the survival chances of all 3 men. It allowed considerable weight savings also, as other parts of the vehicle, such as the hull, did not have to be so heavily armoured. The armour consisted of steel layers with cavities, otherwise known as spaced armour, that was to be filled with anti-radiation lining. Some publications state that the armour was composite. It's not true. I've done a lot of research on this. The composite quote layer on these schematics is the radiation liner. And then there was the two-piston hydropneumatic suspension. The early variant was the American-built and later variant was German, but both were very complex. The tracks were designed by the Germans and were built by them too. 635mm wide by Dale, and the whole thing was powered by several different types of engines. The Americans used two 1500 horsepower Continental engines, while the Germans used an engine by Daimler-Benz, an MB-873 KA500. All in all, the vehicle was very advanced, but also quite complicated. The first US suspension testbed was completed in June 1966, and the German suspension testbed was ready in September 1966. Both were compared in October 1966, but neither was officially selected. Suspension tests continued until 1969 without any clear result. As you can see, a lot of money being wasted as both sides insisted on using, of course, their own model. Originally, it was decided to produce 8 prototypes per country, and the first actual vehicles were ready in July 1967. This was for the American one, and October 1967 for the German one. Both were extensively tested in 1968, but as early as February, it was decided to reduce the number of prototypes from 8 to 6. The building of the second generation prototypes, the 6 that both sides agreed to build, started in 1969, eventually resulting in 3 purely experimental vehicles, 4 prototypes with Continental engines, and 3 prototypes with MB engines. The prototypes were generally plagued with a number of teething issues, and the project was facing more and more and more delays. The prototypes were also very heavy than originally intended, but the biggest problem by far, you guessed it folks, the price. The cost of the entire program skyrocketed to a whopping 830 million Deutschmarks, approximately 544 million US dollars in 1969, of which the Germans paid roughly 310 million Deutschmarks. In the long term, this was completely not sustainable, and the governments of both the US and Germany were starting to realize they were well in over their heads with this tank. And of course, unfortunately, this led to the cancellation of the German part of the program in late 1969, and the Americans followed suit shortly after in January 1970, ending the journey of the joint MBT-70 development for good. The United States continued to develop the concept, resulting in the XM803, but Germany didn't come out of the whole ordeal empty-handed either. The valuable experiences and lessons learned was used in the development of the beautiful Leopard 2 main battle tank series. Visually, the German Kampfpanzer 70 is a bit different from the American MBT-70 version, but both vehicles share the same basic shapes and are quite easily mistaken for one another. The vehicle overall, though, is quite beautiful to look at. It looks a little odd at first, like a Leopard 2 and an Abrams has been squished together and then sat on by a mouse tank. But for the most part, it is quite unique in its design, and I'm actually kind of interested to see one up close and personal. I never have, I would like to. The concepts and the designs of the tank seem pretty practical for the most part. I can see what they were trying to do. Very disappointing, though, that the Americans decided upon a weapon system that really wasn't very good for the Sheridan, and they were putting it into one of their main battle tank programs. I'm sure a lot of time and money was wasted on that. The true irony of this program, though, and the tank overall, and it being a meme, is the fact that the countries could just not agree upon what they wanted to do, and it makes kind of sense. As I stated before, the war was still fresh in the minds of many of the engineers, designers, bureaucrats, politicians of the time, and there's that little bit of jaded history that unfortunately kind of set this tank up for a little bit of disaster. People couldn't quite swallow their pride enough to allow this vehicle to develop exactly the way it should have developed. However, I would have loved to have seen 152mm of missile punching out the front of a main battle tank charging across the European plains. Folks, I hope you learned a little bit about the Kampfpanzer 70 and the MBT-70 today. If you did enjoy the video, please make sure you leave me a like. If you want to be notified of any upcoming videos in the future, please click the little bell by the subscribe button. I would really appreciate also if you go check out my Patreon account. It is in the description box below, along with all my other social media links, my PO box if you want to send me anything, and my merchandise store. Thank you everyone again for joining me. For those of you who are members and subscribed heavily to my channel in regards to membership and joined members, thank you so much for being here and for being a part of my community. For those of you who have supported me on Patreon, thank you also. And for those of you who just stopped by today, thank you also as well. Have a great day everyone. Stay safe in this weird and wonderful world we're in right now. All the best. Bye bye.